Hey, this is Mike, and this is an interview I did with Armi Legge, who is the founder and editor of Evidence Magazine, which is how I first found him. Evidence Magazine is a website that helps people automate their health and fitness so they can move on with their lives. That's how Armi describes it. And what I like about it is it's a sober, science-based magazine that gives you practical, easy to implement tips for improving your health and fitness. I would say it's similar to the content is similar to the type of stuff that I write and that I like to read, where it's science-based, but it's not overly convoluted. And it's dealing with, you could say, the 20% of the stuff that you need to know to get 80% of your results. There are other writers and bloggers and stuff out in this space that I like to follow, but they get into a lot of the esoteric aspects of health and fitness, and they're more, I guess you'd say, on the cutting edge of science and more almost in the speculative of what new emerging research might mean, and that's cool and it's interesting. But I think most people are looking for just practical, easy to implement advice that is 100% proven and known to work, and that's what Armi really focuses on over at Evidence Magazine. So that's him. Let's get to the interview. Hey, Armi, thanks for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's jump into it. So mainstream fitness gurus, a lot of them these days are almost like rabid on the subject of clean eating. And it's something I talk about in my books, Bigger, Leaner, Stronger, and Thinner, Leaner, Stronger. But I wanted to kind of go into a bit more detail and just dive into it with you a bit more, because I guess it's always kind of been a popular thing, but it seems to be particularly popular these days. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think first be able to define it, or at least make an attempt to define it. The general way most people, when they say clean eating, what they mean is just a healthy diet. Right. And generally, when people are talking about clean eating, so as you mentioned, a lot of fitness writers and personal trainers, those kinds of people, they'll describe this to like a new client, and they'll say like, okay, you need to eat cleaner. And that's a really general term. And I think the intention is good. So it's really just like if you're eating like Slim Jims and Doritos and stuff like 3 times a day, that's more on what some people would call like the dirty end of the spectrum. And it's not a very healthy diet. So what those people are trying to do, what they mean is just clean up your diet a little bit, eat a little better. And I think that's totally fine. The problem arises where people take that to an extreme and they get a little too rabid, as you put. And the other problem is just there is no good way of defining clean eating.
Right.
So what people mean is just a healthier diet, but there are all sorts of different ways to eat a healthy diet. It's not like one collection of food. It's not that some foods are bad and some foods are good. It's really just a spectrum, and you have to consider the diet as a whole instead of nitpicking about certain foods. So my thoughts are generally that like the intention is good, and yes, we absolutely want people eating more whole foods, minimizing like their intake of sugar, their intake of more processed foods, but not necessarily eliminating it. And that's not necessary, and it's not necessarily helpful for staying lean or staying healthy in the long term. But the problem really comes when, let's say you have some very well-intentioned fitness writer who says you need to eat clean, or like some like fitness model online taking their shirt off and showing their six-pack and saying, this is what clean eating gets you. And, there's like an element of truth to that because they're eating healthier. That helps them control their calorie intake and hit their macronutrient targets. But there's no evidence that necessarily like avoiding all chocolate for the rest of your life is going to help you stay leaner than just hitting certain calorie and macronutrient targets.
Yeah, I eat a lot of chocolate.
Yeah, me too, man. It's
over time.
delicious.
I mean, obviously, it's pretty calorie dense, so it's not like I'm sitting down eating a whole chocolate bar every day. But that's one of my I really like chocolate. It's one of my simple little daily dessert treat things is, whatever. It's a few squares of chocolate. It's maybe 150 calories, but...
Right, exactly. Moderation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the false dichotomy comes where you have like the one camp who is all if it fits your macros, which I think is like
Pop-Tarts, hot dog, pizza.
Pop-Tarts, dude. It's funny, man, Pop-Tarts are like the epitome of flexible dieting for some people, or
yeah,
if it
what's
fits your
the
macros.
deal, dude? They need to get in on this. They need to realize it and start sponsoring. They need to go,
I know
see
Kellogg's needs
where
to
are
get
all
in
these
on this,
Pop-Tart sales coming from? What are all these if it fits your macros? What is this?
Yeah, the guy from Bro Science Life has an amazing video on if it fits your macros.
Oh, really?
Where he's making smoothies out of Pop-Tarts. It's fucking awesome.
Somebody has done that for sure.
Yes, I'm sure they have. But yeah, so like the idea is you have kind of like two ends of the spectrum. Yeah, your post-workout Pop-Tart shake.
Yeah.
You have one end that's like, don't worry about calories. Like counting is a scam. Macronutrients don't matter. Like it's not what you think. You just need to eat clean. Like avoid all processed junk. The other end,
or you have to just cut out all wheat from your diet, or you have to eat all these weird Brazilian nuts and shit.
Yeah, Tim Ferriss right there.
Such a troll.
Yeah, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have if it fits your macros, like the very literal definition of if it fits your macros, where people, and just to explain that just means that you're setting calorie and macronutrient targets, or sometimes just macronutrient targets, and you don't care about your food quality. You just eat whatever fits within those.
Yeah.
And, I would say from like a sustainability standpoint, or even just like pure fat loss, the if it fits your macros camp is a little closer to the truth.
Yeah.
But you really don't want to be in either one of those spectrums. Like it's not a dichotomy. I think just about anybody who's been interested in health and fitness for more than like a year kind of figures this out by default, that you don't get lean eating a bunch of junk food, even if it fits your macros, just because you're hungry all the time and you don't feel very good.
Yep.
So
I actually just to interpose quickly, somebody, a guy that actually works for me, I bring him up here and there because he's just a hilarious experiment of a human with his diet. He recently was cutting and he lost about 20 pounds. It took it longer. It took longer than it should have though. It took him, I want to say, I don't know. I guess it was about 4 months. So considering water and glycogen loss, he did okay, but what would happen is he'd be good on his diet during the week and then kind of eat too much on the weekends. But he was eating, I believe, like it was probably close to half his daily calories were coming from candy bars. That was like a good chunk of his daily carbs and fat were just from like straight Twix bars. And sure, he lost 20, 25 pounds, whatever it was, but by the end of that cut, he was not feeling very good. His workouts sucked. His body, low energy, just did not feel good. He just did not have that sense of well-being. So, if you're just going to talk, and he didn't necessarily he didn't get super lean. He got relatively lean. He probably got down to the 12% range, and he started a bit higher, obviously. If you're starting 20+% body fat and you just want to get to an athletic body fat percentage, sure, you can eat half of your daily calories from candy bars. But, your workouts are going to suck, your body's not going to feel good, and there are much smarter ways and much healthier ways to do it.
Absolutely. And I think the other big problem too is that if it fits your macros, like just hitting calorie and macronutrient targets or just eating clean or even just losing weight isn't necessarily the biggest goal. And one of the things I like about your books, Mike, is that you do talk about habits. So let's say somebody is dieting for 16 weeks and they don't lose any weight for the first 4 weeks, but they're getting in the habit of eating healthier meals, preparing their own food, that kind of thing. That's still progress because that's the kind of thing that's going to help them stay lean in the long term.
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest things people overlook is that they just focus on the weight loss at first, or they just even focus on the fat loss. Like they set up a very good, reasonable macronutrient targets. They're training decently, but they're not really working on those habits. So that's the other, I guess, issue you could run into with either of those approaches, either clean eating or if it fits your macros.
Yeah, and kind of the dark sides. I mean, so the dark side of, if it fits your macros type of approach of eating half of your calories from candy bars every day is that, like Kareem, he was always battling with hunger. I mean, 30 minutes before meals, he would be like, oh my God, I'm so hungry. So you have that aspect, which of course makes dietary compliance very hard. And then you have the dark side of clean eating, which is, you have to follow all these weird restrictive rules that makes dieting suck and just makes you salivate at the idea of having a bite of anything that tastes good. And that's really the downside of clean eating. It's healthy in a sense of you're going to be getting the majority of your calories from nutritious foods, but the nutritional value of the foods is not everything you have to take into consideration unless you're a dog or a robot and you're just going to put food in your mouth and swallow it every day with no psychological elements coming into play at all,
Right.
So,
yeah, I think, the more the general way I describe it is just the more you try to completely avoid a food, the more you're going to think about it, and generally the more you're going to want it. And there's actually a wealth of scientific studies showing this too, that when you make anything taboo, whether it's drug use, alcohol, sex, anything like that, people are generally more interested in it. And we saw a lot of that during Prohibition.
Even in books, a book gets banned and all of a sudden everybody wants to read it.
Right. Yeah. It's like that South Park episode where they ban Catcher in the Rye from schools, and then all the kids want to read it, and then they're like, man, what the fuck is this? This had nothing good in it.
That's funny. Okay. So I definitely agree on the overall kind of take there, and that's obviously what I talk about in my books. And let's move on to this next point here of so when you're kind of planning and tracking food intake, I know that you've talked about this in other podcasts and you've written about it. And, in my experience, this is depending on how lean you want to get. I'll run into people sometimes, they'll email and they ask, they basically say they hate counting calories. They hate tracking food intake whatsoever. So they are kind of drawn to that, clean eating camp. Because if it fits your macros camp, eat anything, but you have to hit numbers. So some people, they don't like that idea. Even if they can eat cookies every day, they don't want to have to follow a plan. They just want to follow some basic rules. Don't eat this type of carb. Don't eat that type of carb. Eat this kind of nut. Do this or whatever, right? So planning, I recommend planning and tracking because I think it is a good way to learn how dieting works and know that you're not making mistakes by, accidentally overeating, basically. And I would say if you're wanting to get below, let's say as a guy, 10% body fat, as a girl, 20% body fat, you're probably going to have to track. I mean, either that or you're just going to be really lucky that you are able to hit numbers every day. But you have to be very, very familiar with the contents, the macronutrient and calorie contents of food, and you have to prepare all food yourself. Forget about it if you're going out. But what are some tips for making things work when you can't track your numbers or when you don't want to? And let's say as a guy or girl, they're not looking to get super shredded. They just want to lose, they want to get down into a healthy athletic body fat range, but they don't want to get too much into planning or tracking. What are some tips that you could share on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there are definitely some methods, many methods actually, that you can use besides counting or tracking your diet. But before we talk about
eating the same foods every day or something.
Right. But before we talk about that, I think one point to bring up is for anyone thinking about this is that you should use whatever dietary method helps you lose weight for where you are in time right now. So what I mean by that is if you're like 25% body fat and you want to get down, as a guy. Yeah. For a woman, that's pretty healthy. But if you're like 25% body fat for a guy and you want to get down to like 10%, you don't necessarily have to track from the get-go. It could be you use one method to go from 25% to 15%, and then a slightly different method, still sticking to the overall principles of like calories and that kind of thing, to go from 15% to 10%. So now let's talk about some of those different methods. So one that kind of throws a lot of people off is they don't eat when they're hungry. They either eat they keep eating after they're full, they eat for reasons other than hunger, or they kind of starve themselves throughout the day and eat a lot in the afternoon, or starve themselves in the afternoon and eat way too much in the morning. The former is generally more common.
Right. Or the big dinner crowd, where they're going to they're going to kind of just graze on food throughout the day so they can just go ape shit for dinner.
Yes, and I've made those mistakes too. And I think that's I'll say this basically: when hunger is a very good tool to hit your actual calorie needs. Mm-hmm. So generally, we can talk a little bit about set point, but your body has kind of a natural body fat percentage that it likes to hang out. Like for men, the research kind of goes back and forth, but it's generally between like 11 and 18% body fat. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of like kind of variation in there. Like some people like to hang out at lower body fat percentages. Some people, their bodies kind of naturally gravitate towards a higher one. But one of the problems is that people eat for a lot of reasons other than hunger. So let's say you're walking through Costco and they have free samples and all of a sudden you want to try like whatever they have to offer. Or you're at a party and they have birthday cake and you're not really that hungry. but you want to go eat anyway. And like those are all, like that's real life stuff. It happens. Like you don't need to beat yourself up if it happens every now and then. But for most people, that happens a little too much.
Yeah, and then you throw in caloric beverages in there, and then there's a real problem.
Right. I mean, like you have somebody like, this is common with endurance athletes too. I did triathlons for a long time, and you see people just guzzling Gatorade throughout the day, and they're still confused about why they can't lose weight. And it's not because Gatorade's evil. It's just because it's not very filling for the amount of calories that it provides.
Right.
So that's kind of like the first step right there is just eating when you're hungry. And that generally brings you within that kind of like 11 to 18% body fat range. Like that's usually not enough to get you like shredded in like fitness model shape.
Yeah.
But it's a great start. And it's going to help.
And those numbers, just so listeners know, those would be for guys. For girls, it would probably be the, 20 to 26 or something like that.
Exactly.
Or maybe,
it's basically
maybe a little bit higher, maybe 21 to 27 or depending on the body type.
Yeah, for like whenever you're kind of comparing men and women, you can generally just add about 10% to the women's, and that's where you should be. Yeah. So yeah, basically like that's a really good first step, and I kind of consider that a prerequisite for more advanced dieting strategies like specific meal plans, that kind of thing. Just because it's going to make every other dieting strategy you use easier. Like if you plan out calorie and macronutrient targets, it'll be easier to hit those if you're just eating when you're hungry. You're not going to be as hungry throughout the day. So that's a big one. Number 2 would be stop eating when you're full, or stop eating when you're satisfied, not necessarily when you're full. So in America especially, we tend to enjoy our food and we tend to eat too much. And there are several studies showing that just the calorie intake over the past 40 years or so is enough to explain the increase in obesity. And then when you combine that with less activity...
I think it's about a few hundred calories. The average intake now is about a few hundred calories per day, higher than it was in the 50s. I was just reading it up on it recently for an article I wrote.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's like between 300 to 400, I believe.
Yeah.
And which is like
that's
easily
a lot.
enough.
I mean, you just multiply that by 7 and you start seeing how easy it is to just, have that weight slowly just creep on.
Right. It's about a 0.7 to 0.8 pounds per week.
Right.
So yeah, basically Americans
and we're more sedentary than ever as well. In the past
Absolutely.
we weren't necessarily driving everywhere. We were just moving around a lot more. So you combine those two factors, and that's a recipe for obesity.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, before this interview, we were talking about how I had just come down to San Francisco about a month ago. And very few, even despite the fact that San Francisco is a fairly dense city, very few people walk anywhere. Like I'll walk 20 minutes. I took a Krav Maga, which is like a martial arts class a few days ago. Yeah. And it's like a 20-minute walk. So it's like 40 minutes of walking total. And I told somebody, they're like, how are you getting there? I'm like, walking. And they're like, oh my God, you're walking? And I was like, yeah, it's like a 40-minute walk. I guess when you have Uber and like Lyft and all these other things, it makes it a little too convenient. But yeah, basically like our activity levels have also gradually declined. So when you combine that, it's a recipe for weight gain. So one of the things that can really help with that is just focusing on eating until you're satisfied and not necessarily stuffed or feeling like a little uncomfortable after a meal.
And I don't remember if this is just an anecdotal thing I heard or if it's an evidence-based or research-based thing, but for some reason it just pops into my head that it takes about 20 minutes for your body to register in terms of fullness. Like you can eat food and feel okay, but fullness won't necessarily come. There's a delayed fuse on it in a sense, which I don't remember if the 20-minute number is exactly reliable, but I think we've all experienced that where even if you eat too much food and like you just ate a huge dinner and then you're like, I'm not very full, but then 30 minutes later you're like, oh my God, I can't even move. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the 20-minute rule has definitely gotten thrown around a lot. And I think it's funny, I haven't seen that much direct evidence showing like 20 minutes is necessarily the average or anything. Yeah. But I think from just personal experience and just about everyone I've talked to, that's one of these things that you can kind of bet. It's a safe bet, basically, like assuming that is not going to cause any damage. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that generally, like the bottom line is that you generally aren't going to feel full even if you've eaten like a lot of food until a little bit later. Like there is a delay for your body to catch up and register how much you've eaten. Yeah. So one method to help with that is just eating slower. Mm-hmm. And there are a few strategies you can use to do that. One common one is just putting your fork down between bites. And then finishing the bite and then picking the fork back up. Another one that helps is if you're eating with a group, just try and pick out the person who's eating slowest and just match their pace. And all these are described in a really good book called Mindless Eating by Brian Wansink.
That's on my to-read list, actually. That's funny.
It's very good. Very good. Very easy to read, too. And one of the other things he talks about is how generally people don't notice a huge difference in hunger levels if they reduce their food intake by about 10 to 20% at each meal. If they start to reduce it more than that, like let's say you cut your meal in half, 50% less, you're generally going to notice that more and you're going to be more hungry. And another factor that matters too is volume. So one of the things that affects your satiation or how satisfied you feel after a meal is the volume of food you consume, even if it's lower in calories. So some of the experiments they've done where they'll have people, two groups of people drink shakes that have the same number of calories, but in one case they'll whip extra air into the shake so it looks like 30 or 40% larger, and those people will feel more satisfied and they'll eat less at a subsequent meal.
Wow.
So
That's just purely psychological. I mean, it's not like there's extra fiber. There's nothing else. There's nothing causing fullness.
Right. Exactly. It's the exact same shake. It's just that it looks bigger. And they've done the same thing with cheeseburgers. They'll add extra vegetables like lettuce and tomatoes to them to make them look bigger.
Right.
They'll have the same number of calories, but they'll still feel fuller. Now, in that case...
lettuce, you could say, well, lettuce is actually pretty damn filling.
Sure.
Of course, a piece of a little slice, though. I mean, is it really going to change it that much? Probably not. There's probably you're probably getting a combination of effects there.
Exactly. And that's the thing that that's another thing people need to consider is that often we look at hunger as like this very strict math problem. When I eat this many calories and if I reduce it, I will get, proportionally more hungry. And that's not the case. And that's why some people are able to maintain very low body fat percentages like yourself and like myself, is because you kind of manipulate all the other factors besides your calorie intake to make it easier to get to a lower body fat percentage.
Yeah, I was just talking about that just recently. There's also a simple kind of something just to keep in mind when you, the listener, when you're dieting is take your body if you're a guy, if you're at 20% body fat, the amount of energy that you're burning right now, your body every day, it's not going to change that much when you get down to 10%. Like that extra, fat that you're carrying around, it's gonna increase your daily calorie burn a little bit. Just because moving around is going to require a bit more energy. But it's not going to be that different. And especially if you're new to weightlifting, you can count on gaining some muscle in the beginning, even while you're losing fat. So in the end, when you go from 20 to 10% with a little bit more muscle, you may actually be burning more calories. And I mean, really, actually, you will be if you're adding exercise now or adding strength training for the first time, because you have not only that energy that you're burning through exercise, but you do have a bit of that afterburn effect where your metabolism is always just kind of running faster because of the repair and everything that needs to happen. So something to keep in mind is how you're eating right now, like you were saying earlier, Armi, that your body is very good at using hormones to just keep you at your current body composition. It doesn't want to lose weight. It doesn't want to gain weight. It just wants to maintain its current state. And once you get down to your target body fat percentage, you can slowly then start increasing your calories back up to where you're eating right now, or maybe even a little bit more every day, but now you're 10% leaner. So it's not like being lean. A lot of people, they think that being lean or staying lean means basically forever kind of eating less than you want to eat. And that's not true.
No, it's not true at all. And there are plenty of examples showing that too. Both with bodybuilders and endurance athletes as well. And that's another kind of, obviously, like most people don't want to look like a professional marathon runner, but that is a good point. Like a lot of people do kind of assume like, oh, when you get really lean, your metabolism shuts down. You have to kind of subsist on this starvation diet. And that's not the case at all. You can still eat as much or more when you're at very low body fat percentages. Like when you get down to like 3 or 4% body fat, like the very limits of leanness for a guy, or like 8 to 8 to 10% for a woman, you are going to have a larger decrease in your metabolism than can be explained by just weight loss.
You're probably going to wind up in the hospital if you. Probably as a guy, you probably never really, unless you're just doing it for you're going to be competing, so it's kind of stage day type thing. As a guy for a day-to-day kind of living, probably 7 to 8% would be the lowest that you'd kind of want to hang out at.
Right.
And as a girl, probably 17 to 18, because especially for girls, I've found that the hormonal issues can impact them more, and they'll notice because they'll lose their periods and stuff. Whereas a guy may not notice, like his T might be down, let's say 15% because of just the body fat. When you start getting to lower body fat percentages, your body is just not hormonally not the best hormonally. I think some people take that way too far, and they try to say that, like, I've had people try to tell me that being below 10% body fat as a guy is just dangerously unhealthy. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Please show me evidence of that. But there is a point that, you know, research does show, especially when you're restricting calories. Like, if you were just kind of restrict your calories and leave them in a lower range and get down to that 7 to 8%, your hormones are not going to be as your T is going to be a bit lower than it would be if you were at a higher body fat percentage. But you know, it's, you know, that I think that's where I tend to hang out, somewhere between 7 and 8%. And I don't get blood tested, but I don't have any symptoms of low T. I don't run into any issues. I've played around with my calories and left them a little bit low just to see what would happen. And as expected, my training was a bit harder. I'd run into recovery problems. So part of it is like, you can get lean, but you have to then play around with calorie ranges and see what you can get away with while staying there, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree. So I guess the takeaway from that is just that generally you will have to reduce. Anytime you lose weight, you'll have to reduce your calorie intake.
Yeah.
When you get leaner, it gets exponentially harder past maybe like 12 to 10% body fat for guys, or like 20 to 18. Yeah, that's when it starts to get harder. And for most guys, you can stay just as healthy as normal at like 7 to 8% body fat, and you'll look great. Like, you don't necessarily look any better at like 3% body fat either. In fact, some people would argue you look kind of unhealthy.
Well, yeah, I mean, at that point, it's ridiculous. Your skin is paper. You know,
exactly.
Nobody wants to look like that, except for bodybuilders on stage competing.
Right, exactly. And that's the only time you'd really want to, even for sports, that you'd want to get that lean. But yeah, and I think, you know, a really good way of putting it, and Lane Norton is the one who told me this, is that generally you want to eat as much as possible while losing, you know, a reasonable amount of fat or maintaining your weight.
Yes.
And I think that's it's basically like the same as just saying, you know, only reduce your calories as much as you have to. But I think putting it that way is a little better just from a psychological perspective. Like, you're, instead of thinking like, how much can I cut my calories, you're thinking, you know, how much can I eat while still accomplishing my goals? And it's a little bit of a healthier mindset for dieting and just maintenance in general.
Yeah, I totally agree. You had mentioned earlier this body fat set point, and this is actually on my list of things that I wanted to write about, so I just wanted to kind of pick your mind on this real quick. So the concept, obviously, as you said, is that your body tends to want to be at a certain body fat percentage. Some people's bodies, and this is in accordance with your hunger. If you were just to eat, let's say every meal were to contain a serving of protein and some fiber and be good foods, like whole foods that you've made yourself, not like Twinkies and, you know, not Twinkies, soda, and Doritos, foods that are just ridiculously calorie dense for how satiating they are. If you were to follow your hormonal patterns, you'll tend to kind of default to a certain body fat percentage. This is an area that I haven't looked into. I don't even know what research is out there, but I've run into it a fair amount in dealing with people and also just with my body, where it seems like since I kind of experimenting with myself over the last 6 months or so, just kind of hanging out in this 7 to 8% range. Because in the past, I would feel like my natural hunger would take me up to probably about 9 to 10%. And, you know, that would be eating probably somewhere about 3,000 calories a day. And that's where my body would tend to just hang out. That was kind of comfortable. My training was good and stuff. And by keeping myself leaner, it seems like it's just easier to stay here now. Or even bouts of overeating where I'm not like a binge eater at all. I plan like, okay, one day a week I'm going to go out and I'll probably end up eating, I'll be in a mild surplus for the day, essentially is what it boils down to. But I find that it almost now, like, getting fatter almost becomes harder in a sense. I don't know. It's an odd type of, I don't quite understand it yet.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people share that experience. So basically, let's kind of break it down from the beginning. What a set point is just a range. First of all, some people call it a settling point, because that more kind of describes that it's a range instead of an exact body fat percentage. But basically, sure, what a settling point is just a range that your body naturally tends to gravitate towards when you're eating a fairly healthy diet, like you're sleeping enough, your stress levels are fairly normal. One of the things that can make your set point slightly higher is eating a shitty diet, like tons of Twinkies and that kind of crap, you generally are going to crave those foods more as you build up. Tolerance isn't the right word, but basically you kind of develop this reward pathway in your brain where you expect these foods on a regular basis. You keep eating them, and your body starts to hang out at a higher set point.
Yeah.
And one of the things or the biggest thing with food is palatability. So basically and that's just a measure of how much that food encourages you to eat more of it. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's junk food. It could be, something else like, I don't know, like a homemade cheeseburger or whatever. Like some people consider that junk food, but any food that has a high level of palatability, like nuts are a good example. Very tasty, pretty high in calories, easy to overeat.
Or like dried fruit.
That's a great one too. Yeah, exactly. And these foods generally don't satiate your body as much as whole foods. And it's not just like a fiber thing where it's like holding more water in your stomach. Like it's the actual way that it influences your brain's chemistry. It doesn't register as filling. Like your brain kind of ignores the normal satiation signals that come from your digestive system and instead decides to eat more. So one of the things you can do to help lower that is focus more on a whole foods based diet. And there are some other factors that can influence your set point as well. Activity levels. Despite what some people say, exercise generally helps, or actually there's very good research showing it does help match your actual energy needs to your levels of hunger. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it lowers your hunger levels, but let's say you burn 2,500 calories per day, but you feel like you need to eat 3,000 just based on your hunger. Exercise might help bring your hunger levels down a little bit in that case to about 2,500. So there's more of a match there.
Yeah, I've run into that myself, and I've run into that phenomenon working with people and just hearing from people that they've noticed that by starting to exercise, their appetite has come down a little bit, and they were just surprised to experience that because they figured they're burning more energy. So why are they eating? Now they also did change their diet a bit, where now it's a higher protein diet. Now they got rid of the caloric beverages, the obvious mistakes. So. That played a role as well, but I've come across that.
Yeah, no, that's very common. I've experienced that myself too. And then what else? Sleep is another factor that affects your set point. So generally, studies show that sleep deprivation can increase your hunger levels and lower your self-control. And not just self-control, but also increase your susceptibility to triggers that you wouldn't normally need much self-control to avoid. So, for instance, like let's say normally you have no trouble walking past donuts in the morning. Like it really requires very little willpower. You're just not in the habit of doing it. When you're sleep deprived, you're more likely to act on a bad habit, even if it's not that ingrained. So sleep is another one. So those are really the big physiological factors: sleep, exercise, and your diet quality that determine your set point. Then, and this is something that people don't talk about as much, but I think, again, circling back to habits is really the reason. That's the difference basically between like 10% and 8% being able to hang out in that area. So this is one of the reasons too why I'm not a huge fan of like cycling your calorie intake drastically between days.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to get in that habit and maintain it.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of evidence showing that there's really that much benefit.
Yeah.
We talked about this actually the last time we spoke, I believe. So basically, at least in my opinion, I think there is some research to support this, or there is, that the difference between being able to hang out, or first of all, let me circle back. So if you optimize your sleep, exercise, and nutrition, let's say you can bring your set point down from like 15% to maybe 10 or 12%.
Right.
And then once you're there, you can start getting in the habit of just eating less. So you maintain your food volume, like you eat a lot of vegetables, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Slightly reduce your calorie intake a little bit, maybe move a little bit more throughout the day. And once you make those things into habits, like every day you're training, or not necessarily weightlifting, but let's say you go on a walk every morning with your dog or your daughter or whatever. But once you get in the habit of those things, you don't really have to think about it, and it just becomes easier to maintain. And I think that's kind of the big missing piece for a lot of people, is they're just focusing on all these physiological things like I'm going to eat X amount of fiber and that'll help me like maintain this new body fat percentage. Where in some cases it's just automating that so you don't have to think about it,
Right.
and it becomes easier. And like I think just about everybody who's ever dieted has experienced that once you've been doing it for like the first 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks, it suddenly becomes much easier.
Yeah.
It's like those first few weeks where you're transitioning from bulking or maintaining or living a fairly unhealthy lifestyle to dieting. Those can be hard. Like you're going to have some really tough moments there sometimes. But after that, it's I wouldn't say smooth sailing, but the waters definitely even out some.
Yeah. Yeah, for most people, I mean, just my experience working with so many people, it tends to be pretty smooth sailing, actually. If they aren't in too large of a deficit, and let's say maybe, depending on, some people prefer to do a refeed every week, not that they even necessarily have to, but just because it's enjoyable. Some people just prefer to do a standard type of cheat meal. They'll just go out to a restaurant once a week and not really worry about what they're eating and enjoy themselves. And they kind of fall into that a rhythm almost where, they get to eat foods they like every day, and they're no longer running into hunger issues, and then they get to go out to a restaurant once a week, and it just becomes like an easy lifestyle they can get used to. And so I would say for most people, it probably does become a pretty smooth, like I rarely ever hear from people. I can't even remember the last time I actually heard from somebody who had been dieting for more than 3 or 4 weeks and were still having big problems. Like, it's probably happened. I just can't think of anybody where, they're like, oh, I've been in a deficit for 7 weeks and I'm still starving and I want to eat everything. And it's usually just a week or two, if at all. And then they just go, oh, this is much easier than I thought.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only exception would be people who are like bodybuilders, like we talked about earlier. Just like we mentioned, there's a certain point where it does start to get really hard.
Yes.
Like a bodybuilder in his 50th week of contest prep,
miserable.
It's going to be fucking miserable.
Yeah,
exactly.
They talk about it.
Yeah,
there was a guy.
Let you know.
He used to. He would compete in bodybuilding and also in powerlifting. And I remember him telling me about one prep that he was doing, where he would, he's measuring out his cereal. He would get his like 300 grams or whatever of cereal, and he'd be eating it, just talking to himself, saying, I just want to eat, I just want to eat, I just want to eat, after every bite, like literally losing his mind.
Yeah, no, and I've gone through that too, like before as well. Like when you get to those really low body fat percentages, it does crazy shit to your head. So yeah, but again, most people don't want to do that, and they don't need to do that. So yeah, after like the first 2 or 3 weeks of dieting, it does become way easier. And I think that's largely just from developing the right habits.
Yeah. And then also probably just you're probably getting a bit of a hormonal, I wouldn't say reset, but balancing in terms of leptin and ghrelin, which leptin is, just so the listener knows, the hormone associated with fullness, and ghrelin stimulates hunger. So if your body, especially going back to like what you were saying, Armi, with certain foods that they can mess with, where you're getting a lot of calories, you're getting a lot of taste, but it's not necessarily increasing leptin levels much, so you're not getting a lot of fullness. And when you start fixing your diet up and you get some of these, these hormones working the way that they should with foods that the body understands and that have the correct reactions in the body, then that also, I think, is part of it.
Yeah, and then of course the other one is like vanity. When you start to see your abs pop out, you're
That's
like, "Oh
true.
my god, it's working!"
Yeah. And then mild hunger, you don't even feel it anymore.
Right, it's not that much of a deal. You're just like, "Damn, man, I'm looking so good."
Yeah, that's true.
That makes it easier too. Although I would say that's more of a kind of a final like icing on the cake, so to speak, than like a major motivator.
Yeah. So in terms of, you're dieting, right, and even the best of us will slip up sometimes and just overeat. You know what I mean? You start eating something that's good and you should stop, but you don't. What are your thoughts on kind of how to look at this to kind of prevent any further damage, so to speak, and kind of just move on and not get all hard on yourself?
Right. Well, I would say one thing from the outset is just prepare to fail sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of discouraged a lot, is like, oh, you should always, like basically your self-worth, even as a human, is kind of measured as your ability to stick to the diet.
Right.
And I think a much healthier perspective is just think like, okay, there will be some times when I'm losing weight that I'm going to eat too much, and just recognize that. Now, if you already have been dieting and like you've done this a few times and you're beating yourself up, like that's not very helpful. So in those cases, I would say the biggest thing is don't try to compensate the next day or throughout the week. So if you eat like, an extra 3 cookies or something, don't be like adding it up in your head like, okay, like 200 each, that's like 600. Now I need to work out this long to burn that off.
Yeah.
I think
2 hours of Stairmaster tomorrow.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a really unhealthy way of looking at it. Number one, it encourages this kind of short-term mindset where like you're just focused on your immediate calorie intake and you're losing sight of the big picture. Like in the big scheme of things, 600 calories is like, 5 or 10 hours of actual living, and like the amount of calories you'd burn during that time, more if you're working out. So it's like literally delayed your progress by about half a day, maybe. And I think that's really
I would say that doing that is probably going to encourage further behavior. Just like, you've probably heard of research. This was in a book that I read. It might have been Cialdini's book in Influence. I don't remember. But where it was like the school, or it was a daycare, so they wanted the parents to pick up the kids by 6 or something. And they had a policy in place that if the parents were late, they had to pay like $5 or something. And they thought that they put this policy in place thinking that it would, help parents be there on time. And then the amount of late parents, it actually went up. More and more parents were showing up late. Why? Well, because now they don't have to feel bad about it. They can just pay $5 and who cares about being late then, because that's in place. And then on the flip side, I think what actually reduced the incidence of lateness was basically explaining to the parents, like a letter to the parents explaining that the people running the school or daycare have a family too. They need to go home and cook, and explaining why it actually mattered and get rid of the penalty, and then it worked. So in a similar sense, if you eat the 3 cookies and you're like, oh, okay, I got to go do 2 hours of Stairmaster, and you do it, well, then next time when you're like, oh, I really want more cookies, you're immediately going to go to, well, I could just do that and then go do 2 hours of Stairmaster. All right, and it's worth it. And then you go sit on the Stairmaster and you're like, why the hell did I do this? You know what I mean?
Right. It kind of gives you like a false sense of security, or like a false solution.
An out, almost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that encourages kind of the wrong behavior pattern too. Like, the idea that you need to, especially like if you don't enjoy cardio, I've had some endurance athlete friends who are like, I'll just like bike an extra 20 minutes or something. And like, they're pretty healthy about like their food intake. They're not like crazy about it. And I don't think there's anything terrible about that.
No, I do that sometimes. Like, sometimes
it's like,
this is going to be a lot of food, and I'm going to do 1 extra day of cardio just to, just cause, just to help a little bit, just to burn, even if it's an extra 300 or 400 calories, like whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But especially if like somebody really hates in like cardio and they're just way overdoing it already, or they're already doing a lot, this idea that you need to kind of punish yourself to like get more like, oh, I've really fucked up, like I need to correct this with punitive exercise. And I don't think that's the right mindset. So yeah, I mean, like the best thing you can do is really just start fresh the next day. And don't necessarily even try to restrict your food intake. Like, honestly, like 400 calories in the big scheme of things, your body probably won't even notice it. Like, just consider it like a refeed or whatever, just a slip up. Like, it happens.
Yeah, especially if it's coming from, I mean, not that this really matters, but especially if it's coming mainly from carbs or from protein. It's just the thermic effect alone is going to burn off a chunk of it, and your body has other things it can do as opposed to dietary fat, which is kind of just straight to body fat.
Right, and like the other thing is that some people will like freak out if they eat like an extra scoop of oatmeal or something, and generally, again, like it's not that some foods are bad or some foods are good, but it's a lot easier to get in the habit of eating something like Oreos a lot than it is oatmeal or something like that.
Definitely.
That has a lower palatability. So just put it into perspective. I mean, that's the big thing. Like I would say, just focus on the long term and what you're really trying to accomplish, and understand that your diet. Your fat loss diet should really not be that different from like a maintenance or even a bulking diet. Mm-hmm. It's really just subtle tweaks in the amounts of what you're eating.
Yeah, it's just quantity. Like for instance, I recently, I guess I've been done with the cut for a couple months, but I was cutting for a photo shoot. I had to lose, I don't know, I think I'd lost like 7 or 8 pounds, not even anything crazy. But the beginning of that cut was every morning it's a spelt muffin with, I do like PB2 and jelly. It's just good. But it's about, about 50 carb. It's probably about 300 calories or so. So in the beginning of my cut, it was getting rid of the spelt muffin and getting rid of like one other, I don't remember what it was, another 100 calories somewhere, or 200 or so. So, but on a day-to-day, that was it. It was get rid of the muffin, and I think it was reduce my dinner carbs by 50 or something like that. And that was and I rode that out. That probably got me about 3 weeks of fat loss before I had to change anything else.
Yeah, I mean, like we discussed earlier, do the minimum amount you need for your body in that exact moment, and then change something else when that stops working. So like earlier when we were talking about methods to lose fat without tracking calories, one of the biggest things is just cutting out liquid calories or reducing one source of liquid calories. Like I know a few people who are like the kinds who walk around all day like with like a 2-gallon sweetened iced tea like container. Yeah. And like, I'm almost surprised they're not fatter than they are, honestly.
I
like,
know. It's actually is
yeah.
impressive. Some like you start adding it up, and I know people as well that where when you start looking, I'm like, oh, dude, you're like drinking 2,000 calories a day. How are you not just obese?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we can talk about that too, like how your body adjusts to that. But they're burning enough calories because they're moving around a lot of weight in general.
Yeah.
We've talked about that, I think, before too. But yeah.
And also,
so, like,
the more generally, if you're, especially with carbs, your body's going to be in a state of wanting to move. Like you're going to move more without even realizing it, just in the way that like when you start reducing your calorie intake, you start going into a deficit, your body naturally wants to move less. And you'll find that, you know, that can account for a couple hundred calories a day. Just other movement that you wouldn't even totally realize, but your body has energy. So you're kind of twitching around, moving faster.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so like one super simple thing is just remove liquid calories or remove one major source. Like if you want to have whatever, you know, a teaspoon of cream in your coffee in the morning, that doesn't matter. But yeah, like if it's a major source of calories, then yeah, I would cut it out. And, you know, especially with like soda where they have so many diet options now, like you're really not losing anything.
Yeah.
Like if you switch from diet or ginger ale to like diet ginger ale, you know?
Right. Although I would say that, I mean, there was just, you probably saw this just recently, a study came out. They already done it with rats. I saw it over a year ago, but now with humans that, I believe it was sucralose, just alters the flora in your gut. Just more and more evidence coming out that artificial sweeteners, eating a lot of them is probably not good for you.
Yeah, you know, like there's that research, it's really hard to say that.
I know it's not definitive, but it just seems like every few months something else is coming out that just is another like, oh wait, this might not actually be that good. Oh look at this too. Oh look at this too. I mean, I'm not like you know, super against artificial sweeteners. I stay away from them personally, but I would have a concern. Like my general recommendation is if, like, take your average person into fitness. I mean, if they're having, let's say, 3 scoops of protein a day, a scoop or 2 of pre-workout, and then a scoop or 2 of something else, like an intro workout, maybe some BCAAs, or just as your average person or a post-workout average guy in the gym or whatever. I mean, that's a lot of servings of artificial sweeteners right there, and then maybe they're chewing gum as well and having diet soda. Like if you're having, you know, I don't know, 10 to 15 servings of artificial sweeteners a day, I wouldn't do that personally.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is just ask yourself why you feel the need to consume so much of like a hyper palatable compound, like any super sweet thing.
Yeah.
So like I've definitely gone through a phase, like my brother before is drinking, like he's a very healthy guy, you know, normal weight and everything, above average musculature. But he loves diet soda, and he's gone before and drank in like 6 2-liter no, not that many, like 3 2-liter bottles of diet ginger ale in a day. I'm like, dude, that's a little crazy, all right? And like I would just ask yourself, like, why do you feel the need to consume that much of like a hyper sweet something? Like, what's wrong with water? You know, if you're one of those people who does that, or even like you're one of these people who drinks a ton of Mountain Dew or something during the day, like don't feel like you need to completely remove it all at once. You can just kind of titrate it down, or switch to something with slightly less calories at first and then switch to water. Or, you know, don't make it like super hard if that's something that's really important to you.
Yeah, I agree. I just wrote an article on something just called mini habits that I ran into recently that I always kind of done intuitively but didn't realize it was like a thing. And it's just that kind of concept is sometimes if you're trying to add, you know, change behavior, whether it's adding something or stopping something, you don't go all in. You have to know you. Like maybe I'm like kind of good in this way that I can kind of just go all in on something and just do it, but that's me. So you know, if I were drinking a bunch of Mountain Dew, maybe I could just cut it out and be okay. But maybe I would need to, if I was drinking 6 cans a day, let's start with 5 cans a day. All right, cool. Do that for a week. Let's go down to 4 cans a day. You know, just very easy behaviors that you can do without even thinking, where it doesn't take a lot of willpower.
Right. Like that's one of the funny things I've noticed about, you know, like I've been writing about health and fitness for about 4 years, and I've been competing in sports since I was like 4. So what is that? Like 17 years, I guess now.
Right.
And like, I've always been that way too. Like I'm kind of like a light switch, very polar in my, opinion, or not opinions, but just my actions. Like if I want to do something, I just go all in. Like if I'm going to start training for a new sport, like I get really excited and I want to do it every single day.
Right.
But for some people that doesn't work well. Some people aren't as passionate about it as like you and I are. And that's one of the things I've had to kind of learn in my writing and, you know, what I talk about stuff. Like, not everybody cares about this shit as much as like I do and you do.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of meet them where they are and like, okay, you don't want to get rid of like all the soda. Just drink like 2 cans instead of 3 today.
Yeah.
So yeah, and like I think the big lesson there is do what you think is going to be most sustainable and makes you happiest. Like for some people, making really big changes makes them really happy because they really can see like, okay, I'm really taking better care of myself now. Like going from, you know, not lifting at all to lifting 4 times a week or 3 times a week. Like for some people that's like really good immediate feedback, and they generally get slightly better results in many cases too.
Yeah.
And it just works better. So I don't think there's necessarily like a right or wrong approach. Like I don't think doing super small incremental changes is best for everybody. And there's some research that suggests that faster initial weight loss sometimes predicts better long-term outcomes.
Yeah.
But for other people, that may not be the case. So you just kind of have to, like, if you're reading this and like you're not getting coaching or anything, then you need to understand kind of your mindset or your approach and maybe play with a few different approaches. And, you know, if you're getting coaching or something from or consulting, you know, talk to your coach or whatever about this and like say, you know, maybe we tried this, maybe we don't, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, in my experience with people, a fair amount of people will start, like if they're reading one of my books, and they'll start with the exercise portion, and usually on the if they're gonna not just like, some people they just go all in, they just, you know, they make their meal plan, they go, cool, I don't care about, you know, I'm just going to eat these foods every day, foods I like. I want to learn how dieting works. I don't really want to think about it, which is that's even how I do it now. Like I'll leave some foods as variable. Like my dinner is, you know, 100 grams of carbs, and I'll decide when it comes to dinner, like, do I feel like having potatoes today? Do I feel like making some pasta or whatever? But a lot of people, they'll just jump in like that. And then other people, though, they'll go, okay, well, I'm going to start with the exercise, and I'm just going to clean my diet up a little bit. Like I'm going to bring lunch to work instead of having fast food, or you know, I'm gonna stop drinking all the soda or cut back on it and things like. And then over time, in staying in touch with these people, when they see, you know, that their body, they're cleaning up their diet a little bit, which means their calorie intake is usually going down a little bit, and they're adding the exercise, so they see results. They're feeling better, and then that, like you said, it's just positive feedback. Where then they go, oh wow, so if I'm seeing these results by, you know, what they would consider being very loose with their diet, considering what they've just read, then, you know, imagine if I kind of even tighten it up even a bit more, and instead of maybe they're in a very, very mild deficit because of their dietary changes, but if they went into a larger deficit, not too large, but a more traditional weight loss deficit, you know, they start seeing they start seeing it, and they go, oh, well, cool, and then they just, you know, then they jump in.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk quickly about the subject of metabolic adaptation, because it's it's popular right now, and but I think there's something to it. It's not necessarily just a fad thing.
Right.
So yeah, what are your thoughts on this? And you can also just quickly explain what it is, just so the listeners know.
Yeah, sure. So metabolic adaptation is basically, it's just the kind of technical term for metabolic slowdown, or, you know, calorie, a drop in your calorie expenditure.
Right.
And so there are multiple reasons for this. Well, first of all, it always happens while dieting. There's always some drop. Now, you can compensate for that in several ways. But first, let's talk about the different ways it slows down. Number one is that you generally don't feel quite as energized. Like, you know, you're more likely to sit instead of stand, maybe take the escalator instead of the stairs. Like, and this almost always occurs.
Walk slow instead of fast. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
This almost always occurs on a subconscious level. It's not like you're consciously saying like, oh, I'm tired, I'm going to take the escalator instead of the stairs. It's just something that kind of happens naturally. The other reason would be that you are lighter, assuming you're dieting properly and you're in a caloric deficit. Let's say you lose 15 pounds. Well, that's 15 pounds less that you're carrying around all the time. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to also reduce your calorie expenditure. Then there's also sometimes a drop in what they call NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Right. And what that is basically all the little movements throughout the day that don't count as formal exercise or like planned movement. Like right now I'm fiddling with like this little thing in my hand. I think it's like the top of a deodorant box or something. And like, I don't know, I just picked it up off the floor. Like I'm a very hyper guy. So I'm always moving and fidgeting like that. And even while I'm dieting, though, that does decrease. Like, I don't necessarily notice that it decreases, but it almost certainly does. And the research shows that it does in just about everybody. Now, that difference can drastically vary between individuals. Mm-hmm. So one person might have, fairly average levels of NEAT, or, like, we'll just call it fidgeting because that's kind of basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's say they have fairly average levels of fidgeting normally, but when they start dieting even a little bit, it drops significantly. Other people like me might have kind of above average levels of fidgetiness or fidgeting, and it doesn't change very much. Maybe it drops like 10% or something while dieting, and it makes it easier to lose weight. So those are kind of some of the big reasons. All those things basically start dropping during dieting. Now, metabolic adaptation is basically first of all, you expect all of those things to drop. So, like, your weight loss will always be a little slower than you want. Metabolic adaptation, though, is generally the way most people think of it is when your metabolism, like your basal metabolic rate, like the amount of calories you'd burn if you were just lying in bed. Well, technically, that's resting metabolic rate. If you're just lying in bed, it drops more than you would expect based on the amount of weight you lose. So let's say you expect somebody's calorie expenditure, like they're burning 3,000 at the beginning of their diet. Based on all those factors we just discussed, you'd expect it to drop to maybe 2,700 per day, but instead it drops to 2,400, 2,500. So you're like, well, where did those extra 200 to 300 calories come from? And there is a actual drop in your resting metabolic rate. Generally, that there are a few theories on why that happens or how that happens. The most common reason is testosterone drops, thyroid hormone drops. Adrenaline, kind of catecholamine levels drop. Mm-hmm. And so there is a legitimate decrease. Now, that's not really controversial. Like, pretty much every researcher you talk to will say that. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to eat less because, like we just talked about earlier, if you're dieting, you'll probably be exercising more. If you move a little bit more, you're eating a little less already. Like, if you're eating more fiber and protein and carbohydrate too, you'll have a slightly higher thermic effect that can sometimes reach up to 200 or 300 calories per day when you add all those things together.
Yep.
So sometimes you might not need to reduce your calorie intake, and that just happens, and it's not a big deal. Like, real controversy is how much of an effect that has on weight loss. So you'll see some claims saying that, like, oh, I cut my calories, or calorie counting stops your metabolism, so you start gaining weight, gaining weight back. Yeah. And it's impossible, as you said.
I mean, for the listener, just go check out the Minnesota starvation experiment if you just want to see.
Yes, and that's actually kind of the definitive text on this, or like the definitive refutation of this, because what happened in that study is researchers led by Ansel Keys were trying to study the effects of starvation on humans. That was right at the end of World War II. I think it started in 1945. And they had all these refugees and like people in prison camps and stuff in Europe. And at that point, not just like political prisoners or Jews or anything in concentration camps, but Europe was kind of a shitty place to live at that point. The governments were collapsing, and they just had a ton of really hungry people. So they were trying to study, what are the best feeding strategies to give these people. They tested a protein supplement in that study to see if that would help.
Right. Because what was happening, right, is that, I mean, in extreme cases, you couldn't just take people like, that were starving in prisoner of war camps. You couldn't just take them and release them back out and just say, okay, here you go, because then they're going to go eat themselves to death.
That was one of the theories. So, and that's one of the things they wanted to learn. And that can be true in some cases, although I think it's generally exaggerated how much of an issue that is.
They were worried about it, though.
Right, exactly. And so this is one of the first studies to look at that. And what they did is they starved people for about 6 months, and they reduced them down to 50% of their initial body weight on a diet of about 50% of their maintenance calories, which ended up being about 1,400 to 1,500 calories per day. Mm-hmm. Also walking about 30 to 40 miles per week and doing manual labor during the day too. So they had fairly high activity levels. What they found was at the end of the study, on average, their metabolisms dropped 15% more than you can explain by the loss in body weight. Mm-hmm. So overall, their metabolisms actually dropped 40%, but about 25% of that was just from the weight loss. Like, they're moving around less weight. And if you look at pictures of these guys, you'll see.
And of course, they lost muscle, which means less calorie burn.
Yeah, they weren't lifting weights or eating adequate protein, so their diets and exercise plans were suboptimal, and they lost a lot of muscle. But when you look at that, like, that's basically the extreme of starvation. Like, some of these guys, were barely able to walk. They were collecting cookbooks. And one of the interesting things that Ansel Keys observed at the end of the study was that it was really a better measure of a man's response to anorexia, or like staged purposeful starvation, because you saw a lot of these kind of obsessive behaviors, like hoarding small pieces of food, fighting over food in line, where these guys were normally like very peaceful. And that's actually another interesting tidbit, is that all the people in the study were conscientious objectors, or I think they had maybe 2 or 3 volunteers. I don't know why, but and then another interesting thing is that these people starved to the point where one of them, they were allowed to go off the campus or out of the research facility every now and then. And one of them, I think, was helping out, like cleaning at a local house, and he was chopping wood in the back. And then he ended up cutting off one of his fingers to get taken out of the study on mental leave, basically.
Yeah.
But what you find at the end of that study is that, and first of all, you're not allowed to, or ethics boards wouldn't allow that study anymore. So that's why it gets referenced so much, just because it's one of the few studies that actually did this. What they found is that the metabolisms only dropped like 10%. So when you see people who've lost like 20 pounds claiming their metabolisms have slowed down too much to keep losing weight, it's physically impossible. And many, many other studies have looked at this and measured metabolic slowdown from weight loss, and it's negligible and almost always small enough that you can easily account for it with just walking like an extra 10 or 20 minutes per day.
Right.
Now, then we start – so that's like average people. So basically I would say for like average people, like men above 10% body fat and women above 20%, it's just a non-issue. Like it's not even worth thinking about, really.
Right.
Just
to interject quickly, I have run into – it's not common at all, but it is out there, and I've run into a couple of kind of extreme cases with women, mainly women, that have gone through several cycles of crash dieting, very, very low-calorie dieting, and then never really brought their calories back up to a decent range and got stuck in a certain weight range. This is when they, what they're telling me, in some cases, not that they're lying, but sometimes they forget about things. When I really actually start asking them, they realize that, oh, yeah, well, I do have like 2 cheat days a week where I just eat hamburgers all day or something. Well, okay, there you go. But there have been a few cases of people where they were eating very low calorie. They were on very low calorie diets, somewhere around 1,000, 1,100 calories a day, weighing 150, 160 pounds as women, or even a little bit more. And by having them slowly increase their calories, reverse diet in a sense, the weight loss started again. Now, of course, what we're probably seeing was related to water and just cortisol levels being out the roof. And physiologically, it's an interesting phenomenon, but I have seen that before. And what I've seen more commonly is just that people, they cut their calories down to. I generally, what I recommend to people is, depending on how lean you want to get, you may have to reduce your calories from your initial starting point. You can count on it if you want to get really lean. But I personally stop when I reach BMR is when I personally stop. And that's what I generally recommend is, I don't know. Maybe it's just because even if you're not going to cause a bunch of metabolic issues, in my experience with my body and with working with a lot of people, you start eating less than BMR, and you start getting real below, you just don't feel good.
Yeah, that's like, now we're getting to the really juicy bit of the interview, I guess, because this is the part that everyone loves to argue about right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's really as much of a controversy as people make it out to be. So it's almost always women. As we talked about earlier, women generally don't respond as well to any kind of dieting than men. So you sometimes run into women who are eating what seems to be like a diet that should cause weight loss, but it generally doesn't based on their weight. And to be honest, I don't think we have enough evidence right now to say exactly why that is.
I agree.
And it's hard to say. Like, there are a few theories about why this might be. Number one is that it is kind of a hormonal issue. Like, their metabolism is basically slowed down to the point where that is their new maintenance. And I think in some cases that may be the case, or in some cases that may be the issue. I think another reason just could be activity levels as well. Like we discussed, for some people, like we discussed earlier, that generally causes a massive decrease, especially with non-formal exercise. So,
also, like you said, thermic effect of food. I mean,
that can change.
They're not likely to be eating a high-protein diet, and they're probably not eating. They're probably, in a lot of cases, the people that are in this situation are they're eating highly processed types of carbs. Junky snack type stuff is a lot of their carbs, or they're drinking a lot of a fair amount of their calories every day, and they're not eating a lot of protein. So,
right, and I think the biggest reason I think this controversy exists is because everyone's trying to pinpoint like exactly the one reason this happens.
Yeah.
I think it's really more of a collection of many issues. So let's say some woman burns about 200 calories less just through formal exercise because she used to be jogging a lot, now she jogs a little slower. Now let's add in like an extra 200 or 300 calories from less NEAT throughout the day, so she's not moving or fidgeting as much. Yeah. Add in like another 200 or 300 calories from loss of thermic effect of food, and it's starts to become a little more reasonable to see like, okay, maybe this, even though she's eating like 1,700 calories per day, it's not a huge surprise that she's not losing weight when you kind of add in a bunch of little factors. And that's generally how weight loss works in just about any context. It's not like there's one thing. There's usually multiple factors that you need to account for.
Right.
So in that case, it's like, okay, now we've defined the problem. The next step is like, what do we do about it? And in general, it's going to be, I know you've talked about this in your books too. It's going to be the same thing you do in just about any case to like lose fat or gain muscle. If you start cleaning up your diet, quote unquote, just eating healthier foods, you start preparing your own meals, eating more protein, eating slightly more carbs, lifting weights is a huge part of it, and just moving more throughout the day. And generally that kind of fixes itself. And then like too, also, and I know a few people have done this, and I've worked with a few people and tried this as well, slowly increasing their calorie intake. That can help us when it's paired with physical activity. Like for instance, if somebody just starts eating more, I don't think it's that helpful.
Right.
But if they start lifting weights too, they're going to be burning more calories. They're going to need those extra calories to fuel those workouts anyway. Yeah. And that generally helps a lot. And then I would say
and it can help with building muscle as well, which is
right. Exactly. And the other thing is just, I think largely a psychological thing, or a psychological issue, is that when people, like, let's say they stall and they're eating, way less than they think they should be, they kind of start to panic, like, oh my God, like I can't eat any less than this. Like, what the fuck am I supposed to do? But when you tell them like it's okay to start eating more, I think their diet in general gets easier, and they're going to be more compliant with anything, whether it's eating more protein or, preparing more meals at home or whatever. Whereas before, they kind of have this sense of despair, like, none of what I do matters, so why bother?
Right.
Whereas now, if you give them like, okay, you're going to start increasing your calories by 100 per week, and they're like, oh yes, like the longer I do this, the easier it's going to get. So it's a pretty big shift in mindset too, which I think makes it way easier for people to adhere to. And honestly, I think that may, like, for a lot of these people, like let's say you have some 150-pound woman who's eating like 2,000 calories a day and she's stuck. Like, let's say, it's possible.
I've had women down closer to 1,000 calories a day, and that, I would then of course follow up like, are you sure? Are you tracking everything, or are you planning, or are you just kind of winging it? And they would go, no, they would send me their food logs sometimes, say, really, here's my MyFitnessPal, here's what I ate yesterday, 1,100 calories. And in those cases, gradually increasing calories and adding exercise, especially strength training, is what got their I would say not really weight loss necessarily, but fat loss going. In some cases, they wouldn't see their weight change right away, but they would start seeing their composition, their waist would get thinner. And that's if you're going to take one measurement, if you want to know where you're going with your body fat, just take your waist measurement. So I've run into some stranger where I just know that this is something that can work, but it's hard to say exactly why. At least for me.
I would agree on that. And I think that can be the case sometimes. Like, I've dealt with a few female bikini competitors, often who get down to really low body weights too, and they're eating like 1,000 calories a day or something. Yeah. And in those cases, like, really all you can do is start increasing calories. Like, it's not necessarily
exactly.
Like it's
there is that point where if your weight is stuck and you're already at a very low, and by stuck also legitimately stuck, it hasn't changed. Let's say you weigh yourself every day and you take a 7 or 10 day average, so you're as accurate as you can, and it's not changing over the course of several weeks. Then that's stuck. And if your calories are down, in that case, they're probably below BMR. Like you said, okay, can you eat less? Like, is that really? It's probably not a good idea. So,
Right, and it's almost like a diagnosis. Oh, diagnosis is what doctors do, and I'm not a doctor, but it's almost like a recommendation of exclusion, where like there's not really a whole lot else you can do. So it's like, let's just try and eat more and see what happens. And if you gain a little bit of fat, we can worry about that later. But right now, it's just the goal is just to get you healthy, really.
Yeah, and I've found it. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've definitely seen this. I don't know how many people you've done this with, but I've done it with quite a few people. Just because they go through the cycles of they're cutting their calories down, and let's say they had a good run of it, they lost a good 20, 30 pounds, but they have a bit more to lose, and their intake is down now around BMR. And then there's also the psychological aspect. They've been dieting for a few months, and just the idea of eating more food is, of course, appealing. And then they slowly start increasing their calories over the course of the next couple months, bring it back up to where their TDE should be, like, where, let's say that they started it, with their TDE of 2,800, they lost weight, now it's 2,600 or something. So they work back up to that 2,600. In most cases, don't even gain much weight, maybe gained a pound or two, and that's it. And then they can go back into a normal deficit, drop back down to, let's say, 2,200, and get going again. And it's like they just get to start, fresh.
Yeah, I have done that with a few people. And honestly, like, that is one of the few things I'll say that there is just not much evidence it works, but I think it probably does.
Yeah. And I can say for sure, I've done it with enough people where it's something I still recommend, even though I don't, like you say, the physiology, I'm not exactly sure, but it's one of those things that just works and it's enjoyable, and there's just no reason not to do it that way. I mean, how else are you going to do it? You're just going to starve yourself down and then until you can't take it anymore and then start binging? Well, that's not going to work.
Right, and that's kind of the thing I tell people is, like, I can't tell you exactly, there isn't much data to support this, but there's not really a whole lot else you can do.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody's already working out a fair amount too, it's like you can't really tell them to start doing more cardio. Generally doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I think, like, my best guess as to why that works is probably just a combination of factors. It's the psychological stuff we talked about, it's the physiological stuff, and the little things add up.
Yeah, totally, I agree. Okay, awesome. Well, this is great. We got covered a lot of great stuff. So where can people find you and your work?
Evidencemag.com. Everything they need, like I've talked about most of the stuff we talked about now, they can find it there. So just go to evidencemag.com.
Yeah, and I definitely endorse your work. And
thanks, Mike.
Yeah, you do a great job. And just to the listener, if you like my stuff, you're going to like Armi's stuff because it's very similar. He knows what he's talking about, and he can explain things in layman's terms, and he's not trying to show off how much he knows or his vocabulary, which is, I mean, that's something that a lot of people write me about that they appreciate about my stuff is, like you, I try to just keep things simple and understandable and cite research and show that I understand the scientific side of it. But the person reading the article, they just want to know what to do, and they just want to be lied to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I like your work too. So absolutely. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. So thanks again for taking the time to do this, and we will be working on things. Like, I have some ideas I want to talk to you about. So
Sweet.
Cool.
Sweet.